So as part of the Cohen Institute's Distinguished Speaker Series, we're thrilled to welcome Dr. Sandy Maisel for what promises to be a timely, interesting, and entertaining talk about this year's, I'll add, unusual presidential campaign, for sure. Dr. Maisel is the William R. Kinnan Jr. Professor of Government, Chair of the Department of Government, and Founding Director of the Goldfarb Center for Public Affairs and Civic Engagement at Colby College, where he has taught since 1971. He is the author or editor of 19 books, several in multiple editions, including, and this isn't his highest profile book, but I'll mention, including his book From Obscurity to Oblivion, Running in the Congressional Primary, which chronicled Dr. Maisel's unsuccessful bid for the Democratic nomination for Congress from Maine. I mention that because Dr. Maisel is one of the rare and wonderful academics who combines a love of the study of politics, but also a love of real world politics, and he's been very active throughout his career in that. He served as president of the New England Political Science Association, twice a member of the Council of the American Political Science Association, the highest profile professional association in political science for sure, and chair of the American Political Science Association's research sections that focus on political organizations and parties and on legislative studies. He has twice been awarded Fulbright Distinguished Lecturer grants to the Philippines in 1998 and to Brazil in 2012. And has been a visiting fellow at the Cohen Institute in Washington and the Hoover Institute at Stanford. Served as a visiting professor at the University of Melbourne in Australia, at Harvard University, his alma mater, and at Stanford University. Dr. Maisel and his wife, Patrice Franco, who is the Grossman Professor of Economics and Professor of Global Studies at Colby, live in Rome, Maine. So please join me in extending a very warm welcome back to our fellow Mainer, Dr. Sandy Maisel.
Thank you, Rich. This is really a thrill for me. First of all, as all of you know, because I was only moved to Maine 45 years ago, I don't count as a fellow Mainer. I wasn't born here. Nobody who was born here would consider me a Mainer. I hope that my children who were born here are considered Mainers. And I'm convinced that my grandchildren who were born here are considered Mainers. It's great to see Mark Brewer in the back, who is the senior co-author of Parties and Elections in America, the Electoral Process, a book that I began 30 years ago, Mark, I think is right. And that he has taken over, and if you have a chance to read it, the changes that Mark has made in that text make it a fabulous text, much better text than when I was more actively involved in it. It's also really wonderful for me to be at the Cohen Institute. I've been in Maine 45 years. Those of you who are political science majors who have any historical knowledge, in the last 45 years, this state has been represented by the greatest group of United States senators that I can imagine. Margaret Chase Smith, Bill Hathaway, Bill Cohen, George Mitchell, Olympia Snowe, not to mention our two current senators, Senator Collins and Senator King. And what is important to know about those groups, and I know that Mark, and I think Rich may have been at a conference that we ran at the Goldfarb Center at Colby a couple of years ago on the history of the United States Senate in Maine, is that they have been people who believe in building the institutions, who believe in the common good in leadership, and that is a group of Democrats and a group of Republicans and one independent. And I think that all of those who are working in Washington today could take lessons not only from our current senators, but also from those who have come before them. So for me to be here at the Cohen Institute, Rich mentioned when I ran for Congress in 1978, it's when I first got to know Senator Cohen. He was congressman for the 2nd Congressional District at that time and had the Republican nomination for the United States Senate, and we traveled around to some of the same dinners and places where you can find people to talk to in Maine. I was running in a primary, which did indeed take me from obscurity to oblivion as a politician. He was running for the United States Senate for the first time, and led him to be the senator that he became, and then, of course, the great Secretary of Defense. I was trying to figure out how 2 days after the primary I can give a talk about what was going to happen in the primary. And then, like many of you, I watched the Super Bowl on Sunday. And after the Super Bowl, because I was very excited the old guy won, I watched Colbert. And Colbert interviewed the President of the United States. And it was one of these things where Colbert was talking, sitting at his desk, and over there was a screen. And President Obama was on the screen. And at some point during their very funny repartee, it became very clear that that had been a taped broadcast. And in fact, Colbert made fun, oh, this isn't really taped. How do I know it's taped? And President Obama said, well, I will show you. And he said, come over here. And into the picture came Colbert, who was in fact in Washington when they were doing the interview. And Colbert, I can't even remember which of the two Colberts, said to the president, well, if you're so good, predict who is going to win the Super Bowl, considering that we're doing this before. And President Obama said, without a flinch, he said, the Denver Broncos. Well, it's pretty clear to me that he had recorded two answers to that question. He had said the Denver Broncos, and he had said the Carolina Panthers. He then had a great repartee. He said, well, every president knows that, because if you go down to the back of the Constitution in the archives, it lists who's going to win all the future Super Bowls. But they were very funny. I said, I got it. I'm simply going to write 2 lectures about how the New Hampshire primary comes up. And I will send in the right one. And as Justin knows, and thank you very much, Justin, for helping to organize all of this, he asked me to send the PowerPoint for this yesterday so they could mount it. And I sent it to him at 3:20 yesterday, and at 3:12 yesterday, one of the presidential candidates announced that she was dropping out, and you will see that I have prepared that for the slide, which is ready to go in. So I think that there is some possibility to do this. I've been giving talks on this election for some time, and I thought this was going to be quite easy. And I'm not certain, having done this, that there has ever been an election year quite like this one, in which you try to apply what you know as a political scientist, and I think what we as political scientists do is try to apply what we know as political scientists as opposed to what we think as Republicans or Democrats or independent participants, and explain this process to audiences who are asking us our expert advice, not just our off-the-cuff advice. David Broder, who was a long time the lead columnist for the Washington Post, used to do an article, the first article in January every year in the Post, in which he simply listed all of the mistakes he had made in his columns the year before. And I think that we, as political scientists, should do the same thing. And if we say something that we know as political scientists about the current political system, and we're wrong, we should admit they're wrong. So I'm going to start this talking about a little bit about the first talk I gave in this election, which was back in September to the Maine Bankers Association. It's quite odd that the Maine Bankers Association, in fact, met at the Chateau Frontenac in Quebec City. But I have to say, the reason that I gave the talk to the Maine Bankers Association was because they were meeting at the Chateau Frontenac in Quebec City. I thought it would be an interesting thing to do. And some of what I said and what I predicted then, in fact, is true. I predicted for all sorts of logical reasons that Vice President Biden would not run in the Democratic primary. I predicted that the Democratic field would be narrowed to 2, and I had the right 2 candidates. I predicted that the Republican candidates who had a lot of money would stay in the race a long time, and that the field would narrow less quickly than it has in the past for the reason that more people had a lot of money. So I thought, when I look back at that speech, some of those are pretty good. Some of them, however, were not so good. I said, for example, that I thought that the way this election on the Republican side would come to fruition is that the establishment candidates, and I didn't include Marco Rubio as an establishment candidate at that time, there would be one establishment lane out of New Hampshire, and there would be one other lane out of New Hampshire. I had some of the people in that other lane correct. I did not have Ted Cruz. I thought Ted Cruz would be gone by then. And I didn't see that Donald Trump would have the staying power in the way that he has had staying power. And I'm not convinced that any political scientist saw that in the way that it has come to pass. And if so, based on what in political science that we knew that. I thought he would be in because he had enough money to stay in if he wanted to be in. But I didn't think he would be in quite in the way that he has been in. So a couple things for you to keep in mind as I go through this lecture. My main point then, in September to the Maine bankers, my main point now is the same. that this is a very serious election, that elections are serious business, and that it should be treated that way, not treated as entertainment by the candidates, by the media, and by you who are in the audience. Some of the candidates, it seems to me, feel that it should be treated as entertainment, and they play to lowest common denominator politics. That is to say, they do not seem to give enough credibility to the intelligence of their audience, to the intelligence of the voters, to the importance of the issues that we are discussing. But too often it seems to me, and I don't mean to be critical of these people more than they deserve, but I think they do deserve it, that the media, in fact, has egged them on and has tried to make this into a kind of contest that it isn't. And I'm not just talking about Fox News and MSNBC, and Fox News and MSNBC certainly are guilty of this and trying to raise the stakes as a battle between two competitors. But I think it is also true of CNN. CNN apparently thinks that this is target practice, so they put Trump in the crosshairs. I thought that was a terrible image that they put forth. We're talking about somebody competing to be the most powerful person in the Western world, and to pick that person in the crosshairs seems to me a disservice to their audience in order to get their ratings up. But worst of all, the things that I had seen was the Daily News portrayal of the Republican candidates, who seems to think that they are nothing more than people who could be participating in WWE. That isn't what presidential politics is all about. Presidential politics is about choosing the next leader of the free world. I'm going to talk about the process today. But that key point, that one must take away, the one takeaway that you should have from this lecture is that this is a serious process, that we are electing a president, that we are not electing a cheerleader, is the one that I hope you remember as we go forward, because I think it's very easy to lose sight of that, and that it seems to me that there are those who have a vested interest in helping you to lose sight of that. So, what do political scientists have to say about this process? Well, I believe in many ways, and I just came from teaching my own course in parties and elections at Colby this afternoon, I would like to talk about reforming the process and what is wrong with this process. But that isn't what this lecture is about. But I do want to leave you with one thought about that process, which is nobody in their right mind would have designed the nominating process that two parties have today if they sat down to do so. It has grown like Topsy. It has grown for all of the wrong reasons. There is no democratic theory which says that we should be nominating candidates the way in which we do nominate candidates. The outlandish influence of the states of Iowa and New Hampshire, I hope I'm not insulting anybody from New Hampshire here, I think changes the process in significant and fundamental ways that have no basis in theory that I know of how elections should be run. So if you have questions that you'd like to ask at the end about how the process could be made better, I have all sorts of answers to those questions. What I'm going to talk to you about today is what we as political scientists know about the process as it exists today, and where I think we are in that process. So let's start with the invisible primary. The invisible primary is that period of time when candidates are jockeying for position, are beginning to run for president before the first vote is cast. And there are a number of things that they're trying to do during that period. The first one is to raise money. So you see up there former Governor Bush of Florida, who has raised a ton of money during this early period of time. That's what people are trying to do. That's one of the things that the media measures. The next important thing that people are trying to do is to gain endorsements and to get mentioned as one of the front runners. Secretary Clinton has gained the endorsement of hundreds, literally hundreds, of Democratic office holders around the country. Virtually every female senator, Democratic senator in the United States Senate, she was mentioned all during the invisible primary season as the candidate who had the momentum, who it would be very difficult to deter from getting the nomination. Next thing that you are trying to do is to get mentioned in the polls. And I want to talk a little bit about those polls just briefly. There are two kinds of polls that have been reported by journalists: national polls and very early state polls. They have been linked over and over again. They are not distinguished. There has been no effort made by most of the national journalists to say, this is a good poll, this is not a good poll. There is a a website, 538.com, in which Nate Silver, who runs that website, will talk about, and does talk about on his website, how frequently these pollsters are right or wrong in their last polls. But you don't see that reported most often. What you see is only the most recent poll. You don't see how often how the poll conducted in Iowa, polls conducted in Iowa, in fact, determined who would be caucus participants. What we know in retrospect is they didn't determine it very well. We don't see the difference between the national polls, which may say something about who the people in a party want to have as their nominee, and the polls in New Hampshire, the polls in Iowa, or the polls in Nevada or South Carolina, the next two states in which the last poll that I've seen is almost a month old. There's lots of changes, then it's still being reported as the most current poll, including, by the way, I will report it as the most current poll later in this talk. Next part about the last part that I'm going to talk about the invisible primary is the debate. And I think, again, there are important sort of democratic value issues in these debates that aren't debated publicly. Occasionally, in this case, by Martin O'Malley. So let me just say two of them. The first one on the Democratic side is the Democratic National Committee made a decision there would only be 6 debates. Why did they make that decision? Because, in fact, they felt that helped the front-runner, Hillary Clinton. 2 parts of that are wrong. That isn't how a national committee should be making a decision, and they were wrong about whether having a limited number of debates would help Secretary Clinton or not. They scheduled the debates on Saturday nights. Why? They didn't want anybody to watch. And you had to be a real political junkie, I think there are probably a few in this room, to figure out what else you can do on Saturday night. Oh no, I'm going to sit home and watch Hillary and Martin O'Malley and Bernie Sanders debate. So I think that's one. Why do we have these debates? Who organizes them? When are they held? What is the purpose of them? On the Republican side, you've got 17 candidates at the beginning of the race. We'll talk about these a little bit later on. What do you do with 17 candidates? Well, the Republican National Committee decided in their wisdom, in consultation with the sponsors of the debates, that they would have 2 debates. The real debate, and then the kiddie table. And the kiddie table were the people who were lower in the polls. But again, how did they do this? They based it on those same polls. So it's total self-fulfilling prophecy. You don't appear in the debates, nobody knows about you. If nobody knows about you, you get low poll ratings. If you get low poll ratings, you're not going to appear in the next debate, and on it goes. Only Carly Fiorina moved from one table to the other. She moved in both directions, by the way, during those debates. And it seems to me that's specifically about how the candidates in those debates are chosen. I don't have another answer for that. I think it's very, very difficult. But as part of the answer, I would say instead of having a cocktail hour debate and the main event debate on the same night, you might have 2 debates on 2 separate nights and choose who's on each one randomly. It seems to me that's a more democratic process and give candidates more of a chance to get well known. So the invisible primary ends, and we get into a season in which we are doing what is known as winnowing out. Did I do one too many of that? No. Winnowing out. Winnowing is a word that I think appears in the dictionary every 4 years. We don't winnow anything else except for candidates in 2 parties' nominations every 4 years. When what New Hampshire and Iowa are supposed to do is winnow out. That means choose who's going to go forward and who is not going to go forward. Winnowing out is the next stage of the process. That's where we are now, and I'm going to talk about what we say about winnowing out as political scientists. Then the next part of the process that we talk about is the rules of the game. We have finally, 2 days before the Iowa caucuses, somebody came on CNN and talked about how the caucuses work. By the way, a number of us who are political scientists in Maine have talked about how the caucuses have worked on Maine Public Radio, which is in fact a medium for which we should all be very proud, and wonderful shows that are done by all of that team at Maine Public Radio, particularly Jennifer Rooks' noontime talk show. But that's a very important difference. Who shows up at the caucuses? What are the strategies for the caucuses? How is it different from the primaries? How often has anybody talked about the difference between open and closed primaries in this process? An open primary is a primary like New Hampshire in which any voter can go and choose whether they're going to be a Democrat or a Republican. There are some primaries in which Democrats have to choose the Democratic ballot and Republicans the Republican ballot. And there is still a third set in which Democrats have to take the Democratic ballot, Republicans can take the Republican ballot, and independents have a choice of which ballot they're going to take. Those make a difference. It makes a huge difference in the turnout. It makes a huge difference in who's voting. It makes a huge difference, quite frankly, in who's going to win. In the year 2000, Senator John McCain won the New Hampshire primary because it was an open primary. He wasn't gaining traction with Republicans. He was considered way out of the mainstream of Republicans in 2000. George W. Bush, the establishment Republican candidate, did better after that. Important kind of concept. Different goals for different candidates in the caucuses and in the primaries. John Kasich was a winner in the New Hampshire primary. Which of us is going to talk about being a winner with 16% of the vote? All he did was to exceed his expectations. It was a very important milestone for Kasich. But that's not how I determine winner. Winner is the person who wins. Trump won. Sanders won. That's who won the election, but we don't talk about that. And candidates understand that they can set the expectations. If you go back, it'd be a fascinating term paper, and read what each of the candidates said in the week before New Hampshire, I would guess what they were, almost all of what they were doing was trying to lower the expectations. So no matter what they turned out in that last election, they were better than they thought they were going to be. So in that way, Kasich, exceeded his expectations. Cruz exceeded his expectations. He was saying, "Oh no, it's a bad state. No evangelicals. I can't do it." He exceeded his expectations. Bush exceeded his expectations. 11%. I'm still in the race. I'm sorry. That's 11% of the New Hampshire Republicans voting for him. And then Rubio didn't exceed his expectations because he wasn't good enough at lowering his expectations after his disastrous debate performance the Saturday before the primary. And poor Governor Christie really didn't exceed his expectations. So whether it's a caucus, whether it's a primary, who can vote in the caucus or primary? Caucuses are all closed, by the way, they're only party members. And what you're trying to achieve is a very important part of that comes out of the rules of the game. So is proportional representation. And I will argue later on that I think proportional representation may be the most important part of the rules of the Republican Party in this primary nominating season, caucus and primary nominating season. There are two ways in which delegates are allocated among the candidates who are running for presidential nomination. In the Democratic Party, it is proportional representation across the board. It's set in the rules of the party, and it says essentially the number of delegates that you are going to receive in any particular state, and actually in any particular district in those states which allocate by the district, which is I think virtually all of the states except for the one district states like Wales. The number of delegates in which you're going to receive will be proportional to the number of votes that you get. So if you get 60% of the delegates and there are 60% of the votes and there are 20 delegates to be allocated, you're going to get 12 delegates. And the person who got 40% is going to get 8 delegates. That's a pretty simple rule. The effect of that rule is to keep the person who's losing in the race because she or he is always getting delegate support. The Republican Party has traditionally had many more states in which the winner of the primary gets all of the delegates. On the one hand, that's less democratic with a small d. 40% of the people vote for a candidate, they didn't get nothing. On the other hand, if what your goal is to get somebody the nomination and to get it to them quickly, winner take all makes most sense. And many of us who have written about the nominating process for years and years say that the Republican process is much better for turning out a candidate who has time to run as the nominee of the party. The Republicans this time have set a rule in which if a state holds its nominating process, be it caucus or primary, before March 15th, they have to use proportional representation. After March 14th. After March 15th and afterward, they can use winner take all. Anybody seen that reported much in the press? That's a critical factor. It may be a critical factor, as I at least will predict later on, about the future of the Republican nomination. And it's always a critical factor when you have more than 2 candidates. And the final rule that I want to talk about is money. We have heard a lot about money during this campaign. Bernie Sanders doesn't believe in super PACs, if any of you don't know that. He's really worried about being dominated by the 1%. Hillary Clinton has a super PAC. Virtually every Republican candidate has a super PAC. The reason they have a super PAC, which is a political organization which is restricted in some ways it can spend money, but to which people can give large sums of money, exceedingly large sums of money. The reason everybody has them except for Bernie Sanders is because that's what the rules say they can do, and that's the way they think they can get their message across most effectively. The reason Senator Sanders doesn't have one is twofold. One, he doesn't believe in it. He fundamentally does not believe in this, and he says so over and over again, and I think that's fine. The other one is, he doesn't think he can populate it with money. So therefore he says, I'm not going to do this, I'm therefore going to make a virtue out of not doing this. And again, I think that's fine. But the rules of the game are in place, and you play by the rules of the game. If you ask Senator Sanders, if we go to the general election, whether he will use public funding for the general election, if he is nominated, the answer to that is no. He will raise the money privately. Why? Because you can't win if you use public money. You can't get enough money, somebody else is going to get more. And that's been the case since 2000, and it seems to me, again, it's simply understanding the rules. And political scientists spend a lot of time talking about those rules. The last thing that we talk about all the time, second to last thing, I'm sorry, is the importance of the calendar. It isn't just what happens, it's when it happens. So that, you know, people have not spent all this time in Iowa and New Hampshire because they think Iowa and New Hampshire are the greatest places to spend the winter. Not true. It is because those primaries are first. And the calendar of events plays to some candidates and against some candidates. Let me give you just one example. After these first four contests, the primaries in New Hampshire and South Carolina, the caucuses in Iowa and Nevada, after those, there is what is called Super Tuesday. It's an event, and I'll put this up on the screen in a minute, in which there are a ton of primaries and caucuses held all right after each other. A whole group of them are across the Southeast. It's been dubbed the Southeast, the SEC conference, because it's in all the states where the Southeast Conference schools are. Senator Cruz spent 10 days, when most of the other candidates were in Iowa, cementing his support in those states, because he looked ahead and strategically said, this is going to be a big block of votes, I need to be there, and he has been there. And that is related to the last sort of political science consideration, all this, which is strategic considerations. And the strategic considerations say, essentially, you gotta know what you gotta do in order to get a majority of the delegates. It is not just to get momentum out of Iowa and New Hampshire, it is to get momentum going into the nominating conventions at the end so that you have a majority of the votes. Secretary Clinton has spent a great deal of time, money, and organizational energy establishing campaigns throughout the nation, establishing headquarters, staffing headquarters, beginning campaign organizations throughout the nation. Senator Sanders has started to catch up on that when he started making a lot of money. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But he is way behind in that. Governor Kasich, winner in New Hampshire with 16% of the vote when he came in less than half the votes of Donald Trump, is right now down in South Carolina, and he's spending half of each day trying to raise enough money to keep himself afloat. Because his strategy said, if I can't do well in New Hampshire, I'm going home, so why should I spend money anywhere else? That's also, by the way, the same strategy that Chris Christie had employed, which is why Chris Christie has gone home, because he didn't do well in New Hampshire. So I think you have to figure out what those strategic considerations are, who are you applying to, and can you change those considerations? One of the most important things that came out of New Hampshire, is my view, and again, we'll talk about New Hampshire in a moment, but one of the most important things that came out of it is that Hillary Clinton's strategy wasn't working. If she continued following the same strategy, she's going to lose. And if she does that, she deserves to lose. I think the same thing applies to some of the other candidates. If I were to criticize Governor Bush's campaign to this point, it is they have not adjusted their strategy one iota. Now, maybe I'll be wrong and he'll turn out to be the winner following that strategy, but he hasn't shown that yet. So now I want to turn to where are we now? And it's dangerous to do this, because I'm trying to say where are we now that I know as a political scientist, not just as somebody who reads the New York Times every morning, which I do. So, first, we've had the invisible primary, and out of the invisible primary emerged two people who were leading more than we thought they would lead. One is Donald Trump, the other is Bernie Sanders. And finally, during the invisible primary, we have seen, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the Republican establishment has been totally incapable of focusing on one candidate. So they have tried very hard, all the people in Washington who think that either Trump or Cruz is going to be a disaster for the Republicans' down ballot candidates in the general election, to say, let's focus on one, on Bush, on Kasich, on Christie, and even more recently on Rubio. Why? Because they know those four people are dividing up the support, particularly in proportional representation states, and particularly in who people are giving money to, and who can stand up to Trump. So that Trump won, big victory in New Hampshire. How many votes did he get? 34% of the votes. That means 66% of the Republicans voted against Trump. Trump had the second highest percentage of people in that race who said, I would never vote for him in a general election. But he is the winner, and the Republicans are very much afraid of that. So, the winnowing process. That's what came out of the invisible primary. The winnowing process has begun. This is where we started in the winnowing process. There were 17 Republican candidates on the right. There were 5 Democratic candidates. After the invisible primary, we've lost some. We lost 2 of the Democratic candidates. We lost a number of the Republican candidates. Most interesting loss was Scott Walker, the governor of Wisconsin, who many people thought was going to lead the Republican primary, and he didn't. Lindsey Graham, the senator from South Carolina, George Psaki, the former governor of New York, all dropped out. Then we had the Iowa caucuses. And after the Iowa caucuses, I went too far. I went back, Rich.
You should get back.
There you go. After the Iowa caucuses, we had a number of others drop out. Have I got one minute? So, yeah, definitely, you can't, the blue, I don't know if you can see the blue, I can see it on the screen. Anyway, after the Iowa caucuses, a number of other candidates dropped out. Why did they drop out? Because they didn't get to their expectations, because they didn't have support, because their money was going to dry up, because that's where they put all of their, the eggs in the basket of Iowa. Rick Santorum, as an example, won the Iowa caucuses 4 years ago, and he said, oh, when I finish with 2% or 4%, maybe this is a signal, this is not going to be my time. And then finally, we had the New Hampshire primary, and I'm so proud of this slide. This is the slide where I got Carly Fiorina out of it 5 minutes before I sent it off. So after the New Hampshire primary, Chris Christie dropped out and Carly Fiorina dropped out. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that O'Malley dropped out from the Democratic side after the Iowa primary. And I have 2 that are just yellowed, but it doesn't say why they're yellowed. I cannot, first of all, I didn't know that Jim Gilmore was still in the race until I prepared this slide. I don't remember the last time I saw Jim Gilmore's name anywhere, but he is still not dropped out. And I don't know when Ben Carson is going to figure out that, in fact, he is no longer a viable candidate for the nominee. So we have a bunch left, and then the question becomes, who are these people who are left with the winnowing process, and are they going to continue to stay in the race any longer or not? I don't know the answer to that. I think for sure we have some candidates in the race who are going to stay there, but I don't know whether how long Bush can stay in. I don't know how long. I think Bush or Rubio, one of them can stay in. I don't know how long the other one can stay in. I think we're simply going to have to find that out. Then you look at the calendar. This is challenging my ability to do this, but it works. So if you look at the Republican calendar, and it comes on here, this is the slide that, by the way, shows how many superdelegates that Secretary Clinton has, and we come up here to Super Tuesday.
It's showing up on your computer, not up here.
All right, I'm going to tell you what it says. How do I get rid of it? Let me just X this out. See what it's like. I've lost it. Okay. Got a thought?
You're up there. That's what you got up there.
Or
You need
back
back
over to the next one. Welcome. Okay, so let me tell you what the road ahead said. Democrats had the Nevada caucuses next week, and the week after that, they have the South Carolina primary. The Republicans have them in the opposite order. It's sort of important to know with this that these are all determined by the parties themselves. There's no national primary, there's no national legislation on this. The states determine when they're going to do it, and the parties within the states determine when they're going to do it. Those are important. It seems to me that Secretary Clinton has to stop the bleeding. If she doesn't do well in either of those two, she is in a very, very serious way. And somebody like John Kasich has to figure out what he's going to do next when you have these coming up. And then you have Super Tuesday. And on Super Tuesday, which is on March 1st, you have Alabama, you have the Republicans in Alaska, you have Arkansas, Colorado, Georgia, Massachusetts, Minnesota, North Dakota, only for the Republicans, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Texas, Vermont, Virginia, and Wyoming, again, only for the Republicans. That's a lot of states, much better if you've seen it, spread throughout the entire country. And that's a really important thing to understand. The candidates, unless you have a good campaign organization, can't campaign in all those states. They can't spend all the time on the ground in all those states. They have to decide where to go. The key to looking at these dates is to see what they mean to different candidates. Where does Kasich win? When Rubio and Cruz are squaring off in some of the states that have large evangelical populations for the Republicans, who wins them and who loses those states? Is there anybody who can stand up to Donald Trump and the Republican Party in those states? All of those states are proportional representation. That is a tremendous incentive for somebody like Governor Kasich, who's desperately waiting until the Midwest votes when Michigan and Ohio vote week after that. Michigan 1 week after that, Ohio 2 weeks after that. He's desperately waiting to go to get as far as those states where he might have a better chance. It's more his home turf. Governor Bush, who has a great deal of money still, wants to continue as long as he can because he's piling up some delegates until he can find some place to get a win. The Democrats, I think, will continue on for a very long time. One of the things that Senator Sanders demonstrated, it's fooled me, fooled many of us, is that he has done amazingly well in raising money. And as he has raised money, he has defied experts who think that it wasn't going to be possible for him to raise money. And he has, more than anybody thought, set the tone for this campaign as it goes forward. Hillary has shown vulnerability that nobody thought was going to be possible. Nobody thought that Hillary was going to be doing as badly as she has done in Iowa and New Hampshire. But if you ask the experts, and I'm going to tell you who the experts are in a minute, most experts still believe that Hillary Clinton is going to win the Democratic nomination. There's a Democratic pollster named Jeff Garrett, and he has a list of 175 pundits. I'm on the list. I have no idea why I'm on this list. I think I'm on the list because his son went to Colby. But there are 175 people, most of whom know a heck of a lot more than I do. When he asked those 175 people the week between Iowa and New Hampshire, after Hillary had not done very well in Iowa, who was going to win the Democratic nomination, 97% still said that Hillary was going to win the Democratic nomination. I think that's really important. My answer to this is that Hillary has a basic problem. Politics is like poetry, and governing is like prose. Hillary writes prose. Bernie writes poetry. She has not been able to capture anybody with the kind of campaign which she is running. In my view, Hillary is still in this race largely because she is running one-on-one against Bernie Sanders. And I will talk a little bit about why I think that's a problem later on. But if she were running one-on-one against Elizabeth Warren, I think she'd be done. If she were running one-on-one against Vice President Biden, I think she may well be done. Not saying that you were running with Sanders and those two people, but she's running one-on-one against somebody who is very far out of the mainstream of the Democratic Party. And that means that she has time, I believe, to sort of catch her breath and see whether it's possible for her to come back. And I don't know whether it is or not. So there are two splits in the Democratic Party that I think we have to be aware of. The first is about you all. This is a graph which shows how the people under 29 voted in the Iowa caucuses. All the people, 50% of the people under 29 who voted in either of the caucuses in 2 weeks ago in Iowa voted for Bernie Sanders. And look at how small the number is for Hillary Clinton. If you just look at the Democratic Party in that time. 84% voted for Sanders, 16% voted for Clinton. If you look at the New Hampshire primary, Democratic primary in that same period of time, 83% voted for Sanders, 17% voted for Clinton. That's a very, very problem for her. But let's see what goes forward from that. Look at minorities and look at gender. This is the last, now 3 weeks old, South Carolina poll. It was done for the NBC News and Wall Street Journal by Marist. It's a pretty good poll. I don't think it's the best poll. 2,500 likely voters in the Democratic primary. That's a very big sample for a poll that size. It shows that of the African American population in South Carolina, 74% say they're going to vote for Clinton, only 17% for Sanders. That she is hoping for desperately. She leads also among the white population. You have to remember, South Carolina is a much more conservative state than is New Hampshire, Iowa, or virtually anywhere else. There's been a great deal of talk about the early results in which Sanders has beaten Clinton 55-44 in New Hampshire, that he can maintain his lead over, that he can keep close among women, that he can maintain his lead under young voters. Clinton has to demonstrate that, in fact, she can change the narrative and that she, in fact, can become the candidate that she thinks she is. So these are the polls among whites and non-whites, national polls, the last time they were among whites and non-whites. Hillary has to prove in South Carolina that this is in fact what's going on in this race, and that people understand that this is what's going on in this race. There's talk about a firewall. That's her firewall. She has counted on the African American community backing her, as they always have backed Clinton, except for when she was running against an African American candidate in the 2008 primaries. If that doesn't happen, she's done. If it does happen, we are in for a very, very long race, and I think a race that's going to go beyond the Clinton people are saying, oh, it's still going to be decided in March. I don't see how it's going to be decided in March. Democrats have proportional representation. There are a certain number of states that Sanders is going to win. He's very likely to do well in Massachusetts. He's very likely to do well in Minnesota, which are Super Tuesday states. He's going to do very well with the liberal wing of the Democratic Party. So I think that that's the likely sequence. Not because I'm predicting, but because I've seen data out there that somebody has to disprove. But there is a measurement point, a very clear measurement point coming up in these next caucuses and primaries, in which Clinton has to say, are you the person, in fact, that people have said you are, or are in fact you over the hill and beaten by a 74-year-old guy? That's kind of weird. What about for the Republicans? Well, I'm not going to try to play with that. Let me talk first about ideology. First of all, it's much harder to talk about the Republicans than it is about the Democrats. You don't see the same age differences so far. There are virtually no minorities in the Republican Party voting in the primaries that you have to deal with. You don't see the gender split that you see within the Democratic Party. There are differences between among the candidates, but I'm not quite sure how they're going to play out. And I think anybody who thinks they know how they're going to play out is wrong. Former Governor Sununu of New Hampshire said on Tuesday, now it gets down to the real primaries. In Iowa they pick Cohen, in New Hampshire we pick presidents. I'm not convinced that New Hampshire has picked the president in this last race. The statistic probably that's the hardest to overcome is that New Hampshire that nobody's finished below second in New Hampshire has won the presidency in a very long time. There are a lot of people who finished first and second in that race, including both Sanders and Clinton on the Democratic side. So the Republicans, though, have to figure out, what do they mean on ideology? Senator Cruz from Texas is the most consistent ideological conservative who has run on the national stage probably ever. Some may say Barry Goldwater in 1964 was that consistent. I'm not convinced he was. Sanders does not budge. I'm sorry, that's also true. But Cruz does not budge from being the ideological consistent person. What do you do with that? It seems to me that he has to succeed in those states which are considered, in which the Republican Party is considered to be ideologically very conservative. South Carolina is clearly one of them. Minnesota, interestingly, is one of them among the Republican Party. Arkansas is one. Texas, his home state where he's running on Super Tuesday. Oklahoma, Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, and even Virginia. He has to do well in those states. Many of them are early. but they are all proportional states. If he does well, he is still not going to sweep through all the delegates that people are talking about. Rubio and maybe Bush and maybe others are more moderate candidates, and they have to do well in the states where the Republican primary electorate is a moderate primary electorate. New York, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Maryland, Delaware, Indiana, California, and New Jersey. They're only relevant if one of these moderate candidates can survive through Super Tuesday, if they can show that they can win anywhere, if they can get enough delegates, if they can get enough votes, that they can continue to raise money and be relevant. Donald Trump's appeal is much more eclectic. I don't know anybody who has been able to measure the, quote, in your face, close quote, Republican Party. But that's what Donald Trump is. He is saying, I'm in your face, I'm going to say what I think about you, I'm going to say it in the language that I want to use, and his audience loves it. I don't love it. Tom Brokaw was on NBC News the other night saying he thinks it is disrespectful to the office of the presidency. Trump was on NBC News talking to Lester Holt saying, look, they fighted this. I repeated the word that he repeated about Cruz. I won't repeat it here. And the audience gave me a standing ovation, so I'm going to keep doing it. But he says, in one of the great non sequiturs of American political history, I had an uncle who was a professor at MIT, and I know how a president of the United States is supposed to act. Now, if somebody can tell me what the link between having an uncle who was a president of the United States and knowing how, who was a professor at MIT and knowing how to act, it is beyond me. But Trump has basically said, I'm going to do anything I can to get votes. I'm going to act in the way that, what I called earlier, lowest common denominator politics to get votes, and then I am going to be different when I'm president. I don't understand that. The second thing the Republicans have to do is to deal with the evangelicals. And the evangelicals are a very important part of the vote in the Republican Party. The evangelical community in Iowa was a unified political community that came together for Ted Cruz. The evangelical community in many of the other states is divided. And Cruz has to figure out whether he can get all those evangelicals or not. But he has been working those states all through this process. He is organized in those states. He is organized through evangelical churches in these states. And I think that gives him a tremendous advantage going forward. And then there is the question which we talk about all the time, momentum, and what you do with the momentum as you go forward. I think that's the key for Trump. Somebody has to blunt Trump's momentum by Super Tuesday, or he may be able to play out the card simply by staying ahead with the proportional states through March 14th, and then continuing to win some of the winner-take-all states. He may, if he's as good at that. If he keeps his up to where his poll numbers have been, as he's heading into these states, I think he's very difficult to stop. What Trump looks like to me is this. There's this huge crowd, and they keep coming for him. Now, I have to tell you one quick story about myself before I conclude, because I don't want to go on too long about this. 1976, I was a young professor at Colby, and I was invited to go to a meeting at the Holiday Inn, which doesn't even exist anymore, in Waterville, to meet this candidate for president named Jimmy Carter. And it was a 12 noon event, and there were only about 20 of us invited. And I said to the organizer, I said, I've got a 1 o'clock class. My partisan election class met today, always met at 1 o'clock. I said, I have a 1 o'clock class. I'm going to have to walk out. I'm this former governor. I don't mean to be disrespectful. The organizer said, Jimmy Carter is always on time. He will walk in on time. He will walk out on time. He'll meet your class. He's scheduled to be here 35 minutes. He'll be here 30 minutes. I get there. Dot of 12 noon, in walks Jimmy Carter. And he said, hi, I'm Jimmy Carter. I was governor of Georgia. And I'm glad to meet you all. And went around and shook hands with me and said, I'm running for president because I think I can do a better job than anybody else. I just spent my time in Bangor, and I'm here in Waterville, I'm going to Augusta, I'm going to Lewiston. I'm going on to be president of the United States. Out he went. With Hamilton Jordan, who some of you know went on to be his chief of staff. Never heard of either of these people before. I'd heard Carter's name, but knew anything about him. Nothing, no substance, no plan, nothing. I go back to my class, and I said, I just met the weirdest man I've ever met my entire life. And he thinks he's going to be president of the United States. And if I know anything as a political scientist, I know that Jimmy Carter is not going to be president of the United States. So, let me tell you my projection for the Republicans. I don't know anything. I'm a political scientist in this one, and I'm guessing. And I'm really guessing what I want to happen, what every political scientist in this room, in their heart, wants to happen. You know you do. We want it to be a brokered convention. We want it to go beyond these states. We want Trump not to get a majority of the votes. We want him to go in, or any of those candidates to go into the convention in Cleveland with 40% of the vote, 38% of the vote, somebody else has 20% of the vote. And I'll tell you what we know about how a brokered convention will work. Absolutely nothing. And all of us, I'm looking at Richard and Mark particularly, we would give our eye tooth to be there and simply watch how it unfolds, because we have no idea how it will unfold. There has not been a convention that went to a second ballot since 1952. So we are not talking about something in which there's a lot of recent history. But we read back about the 1924 convention, we put 103 ballots in 3 days, and you think, wonder if they had the hotel rooms booked for that long, and all these kind of logistical questions. And what I do know for a fact is there are people at the Republican National Committee right now saying, uh-oh, we at least have to figure out what we're going to do here, because we really don't know. Who controls these delegates? Who controls the Trump delegates if Trump drops out? We have no idea. In our textbook, we talk about party organization. You all know who the Republican state chair in Maine is, or the Democratic state chair in Maine is, or what they do, or how they got there, or how important they are, or how important they're not. None of us knows this. It would be so much fun to watch. I'm not predicting it. I'm just saying it's pretty interesting. I think I've strayed a little bit too far from what political scientists knows into what I may think. So let me sum this up as best I can in just a few words. First of all, you all should know who this is, but you don't, but I will tell you. This is Amy Walter. Amy Walter is the national editor for the Cook Political Report. She appears every Monday night on the NewsHour, PBS NewsHour, as one of their political analysts. She is, in my view, the smartest political analyst in the country. She's also my former student. Went to Cohen. Now, I have to say, I think I taught Amy, until she went down to Washington, everything that she knew. I think since she has been to Washington, she's taught me virtually everything I know. And she had a great line about this ongoing process in which she said, basically, we are living in some sort of alternative universe where black is white and white is black, up is down, down is up, and nothing is as it should be. So what do we know? We know on the Republican side, a blowhard reality TV star who thinks he can make Mexico build a fence, who thinks that John McCain, a Republican icon and a war hero, is unworthy of praise, who attacks the popular Fox News, the host of Republican Party politics, and then rises in the polls after every one of the things that he has done. And Donald Trump says, I'm going to keep doing them because every time I do something like this, I do better in the polls. That makes no sense to me. It makes no sense to anybody else who has watched this kind of politics. On the Democratic side, we have the first serious woman candidate for president, a woman who has we all know Margaret Chase Smith was the first woman to be put in nomination for president. But the first woman who has a serious chance to be president of the United States may very well have her prospects totally overthrown by a 74-year-old white Jewish male socialist from a state that has more cows than people. That makes no sense to me whatsoever. And I don't understand it. Believe me, I do not understand it. I've tried as hard as I can. I do not understand either of those kinds of things. I understand what Sanders is doing. I understand what Trump's doing. I do not understand why the other people are not responding to it, as normal politicians should be doing. So what have we learned so far, and what is the takeaway from here? I'm going to get two of them at once. First of all, I think the first thing we've learned is that pollsters know nothing about predicting turnout in caucuses, and you shouldn't pay any attention to them as they try to predict caucuses. I also think we know that there are too many polls, that some of the polls are done very badly, that there is very little effort to determine which of these polls is good, which one is bad. They are reported too often. Too much of what we know is driven by the polls. I also think we know that Tim Krause was right. Timothy Krause in 1973 wrote a book called Boys on the Bus, in which he defined PAC journalism. PAC journalism, oh no, that's not PAC journalism. That's PAC journalism, or that's PAC journalism, or that's PAC journalism. PAC journalism is a term that he coined which essentially says that one journalist comes up with a story, and every journalist reports the same story without independently reporting on it or determining whether there's any sense to be made of that story. And we have seen it over and over and over again in this election cycle. There are very few people who are standing out there and saying, I think I'm going to look at this a different way. There are very few people who are standing out there and saying, I'm going to figure out who this 40% of the New Hampshire independent voters who don't decide until election day are. Those are, seems to me, the journalists worth following, not the journalists who simply say that because somebody else has reported the story, often my friend Amy Walter has reported the story, we should write that same story over and over again. And then I want you to remember that whoever is elected president in 2006 is going to face a Republican House of Representatives, because there is no way, even if the Republicans nominate Ted Cruz, that the Democrats are going to take over the entire House of Representatives. They're going to face a very closely divided Senate, in which neither party will have 60 votes, and therefore neither party will be able to do anything dramatic because of the rules of the Senate. And none of these candidates, most definitely not Senator Cruz or Senator Sanders, are going to be able to do half of the things that they are promising. And once again, the American public will be discouraged because the candidates have said that they're going to do things and they're not able to follow through on them. They're not able to follow through on them because that's the way the founders designed our country. The country was not designed, in terms of the political system, to make drastic swings from left to right. It was designed to muddle through, and that's what we do. But while the election is very entertaining, it is also deadly serious. In my view, we are at a very key moment in American history. We are facing very real problems domestically, income inequality, dissatisfaction with the government, and we are facing serious, serious problems internationally, the rise of ISIS and terrorism, the Middle East, which is still embroiled in conflict that we will become involved in, a Russia that has threatened us in new ways, and even now a North Korea which seems to not be listening to anybody who says take a sane approach to nuclear weapons. And whoever we elect is going to face all those problems. So I implore you to take your vote seriously, that remember it is a president we are electing. You have to think about the job that that person is going to be elected to do, and think of who that person is who you want to remember, who you want to represent you. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Tell me where you're from.
We're Cats. I'm a senior here at the political science department. Looking at the demographics of the upcoming election and how the white vote is being marginalized and cycle do you think Donald Trump is even, is able to win the presidency with the map candidates if he gets nominated?
I think no. I think virtually all the Democrats, yes. I think if the Democrats have Mike Sanders, he might. I think most Democrats are saying they would love to run against Trump or Cruz. They are both systematically alienating large blocks of the population who want to turn out to vote. I have a student did an honors thesis last year looking exactly at the demographic question. And his conclusion was that the Republicans could still win in 2016, but by 2020, if the Republicans don't change their appeal to Hispanics and to African Americans, they have no chance of winning. And that some states, which we think of as heavily Republican states, like Texas and Georgia, will become either purple states or blue states very quickly. So I think Trump is in a lot of trouble on that. I think I'm going to build a wall, and now we put a price tag on it, $11 billion that the Mexicans are going to pay for it. It may be good campaign rhetoric, but to the Republican electorate, it isn't good campaign rhetoric for the general election. Yeah.
I'm from
Where are you from?
I'm from Massachusetts. My name is Doug. How much of an advantage are the Republicans at in the presidential election, given that it's been a Democrat in the White House the last 8 years?
I think if the Republicans were to nominate a Kasich or a Bush, they're in a tremendous advantage. We've had 8 years of the president in the White House. It's not just a president, it's a president whose popularity is not very high, below 50%. All of our history tells us that electing a president for a third term, which is what Secretary Clinton is basically asking for in these primaries, is a losing strategy. It did work for the first President Bush, but that was with a president who was much more popular than Barack Obama. Where you lose this trend is if the Republicans go off to an extreme and the Democrats don't. So then you say, is the parallel 1964 for the Republicans, or is the parallel 1972 for the Democrats? 64 when the Republicans nominated Goldwater, 72 when the Democrats nominated Bush. I don't know McGovern. I don't know the answer to that because we're new territory. You know, a couple of weeks ago, former Mayor Bloomberg of New York floated this trial balloon about, well, maybe I'll run as a third-party candidate. The reason you float trial balloons is to see whether they fly or not. His did not fly. It fizzled very quickly. But I think if the race comes down to Cruz and Sanders, somebody like Bloomberg is going to get in that race, and that makes it a very interesting race. And by the way, advantage of Republicans at that point, because Bloomberg is taking many more votes than the Democrats. Yeah.
So I'm from Lewiston. I just wanted to kind of hear your opinion about how certain candidates like Trump and Sanders, everybody, have really kind of pulled young voters out to the polls, and how that's going to affect the race.
I can answer it better for Sanders than Trump. Let me give the answer for Sanders, and then while I'm giving the answer, I'll try to think about the answer for Trump. Because I'm not sure, first of all, I'm not sure he has. He's pulled new voters, I'm not sure they're necessarily young voters. On Sanders, I think it is much more easy to campaign as an idealist than it is as a pragmatist. How can you say, let's go to the barricades for moderatism? That just is not a winning strategy. But that, in fact, is what Hillary Clinton is. You know, the Republican Party portrays her as this person who's so far to the left that you can't believe it. She's probably further to the left than her husband was when he ran originally. But the people who opposed her in 2008 opposed her because she was a moderate. They thought Obama was to her left. I think they were wrong, but that's what they thought. She said in one of her very early appearances, I'm a pragmatic progressive. I'm sorry, that is not a winning appeal for a 68-year-old grandmother. You know, it isn't, and Bernie is saying, I have this, you know, he will not disavow the word socialism. You know, if I want to come back as something, I want to be the Republican campaign manager against somebody who's running as a socialist. Because God, I can be real good at doing that. I would hate to have to do it, but that is not a winning general election strategy, but it's sure a winning strategy to get people out and say, you know, I'm sick of the 1%. I am sick of the fact that super PACs dominate this election process. I love the fact that he has had 3.7 million, it's not more, individual contributions from 1.8 million people. All that says, it's democracy flourishing. I think that's appealing. It's a really good strategy. And she has had no response, you know, at all. And the response she's had, you know, bless her heart, Madeleine Albright got that one wrong. She may be right in what she said, but you don't say it. You know, I think there's a whole generation of feminists who say, we've fought our whole lives to get to this point, and now we're going to lose to a 74-year-old man because women won't stand together for Hillary. I think but you don't say that to 25-year-old women. And you certainly don't say what Gloria Steinem said, which I thought was one of the most sexist comments I've ever heard. Well, no, I've heard more sexist, but it was sexist enough. Yeah.
Do you think gerrymandering has any impact on the presidential election? Not so much, probably.
I wrote an article some years ago, Margaret probably find it that you asked for it, about gerrymandering having a great deal of effect on the House. Less than people think, because remember there are a lot of states in which you can't effectively gerrymander, ours being one of them, and the states that only have one representative being one of them. But I think what it does is it makes it easier for people to run ideological campaigns because there's so many safe districts. It isn't, you know, they aren't so far out of line in many ways, but they create them so they are politically safe for one party or the other. And that means that the real race is to be the most liberal Democrat or the most conservative Republican to get the nomination to seat that you're going to win. So I think it's a real problem for the House. I think it does create some problem for some Senate, for some congressional districts. If they were going to go to the district system that Maine uses and Nebraska uses, but for the system that we use in the rest of the states for the electoral college, I don't see how it has an effect. You know, despite the fact that we are way ahead of our time on our district system and having the district system, I don't see others jumping to follow. Yeah.
My name is Justin. I'm from Turner. you kind of touched upon the female vote, that gentleman over there. Earlier, a few slides, you showed the numbers for the primary votes in South Carolina.
I can get it back in a second if I can find the arrow.
Well, with the exception of the African American vote in 2008, because she was running against an African American, how do those numbers compare 2016 to 2008?
She did very well at this stage in the process in 2008. With, if instead of looking at Clinton versus Obama, if you look at Clinton's favorability rating among African American voters, she did very well, just about these numbers. Then if you remember, Bill Clinton made a terrible campaign flaw in the South Carolina primary in which he basically said, oh, people are only voting for Obama because he's black. And it just turned the whole thing against her. And it really went badly against her. And she didn't say it, he did. And it's taken her a while to get back there. But this has been, you know, this is what her base is. I mean, her base is women working on children's issues, working on minority issues. She was involved in the civil rights movement way before her husband was involved in the civil rights movement. These are people who she has been relating to for a very long time. So I think, you know, that she's right. And Sanders, who probably has never cast a vote that any African American would object to, you know, on civil rights or any issues like that, has never been out front of those issues. You know, you can say whatever you want for Bernie Sanders. He is a great politician, and his constituency is all white and gun owners. And, you know, and he was a politician who wanted to win in that district and that state. One state and district are the same. Yeah.
So are you saying it's not so much that Bernie Sanders is doing poorly with African Americans as it is that Hillary Clinton is doing very, very well?
I think so. Yeah, I don't think there's an anti-Sanders vote among African Americans. If there is, I don't know on what it would be based. His voting record is fine. This has never been what he talks about. Bernie Sanders talks about one thing: income inequality. It's a very important issue. It is not the only issue on which this election should be decided. You know, when you ask him a question about Afghanistan and he responds about Iraq, that makes me nervous. You know, but that's not what people are voting on. They're voting on that one issue. And I think his sense of optimism, which is, it's infectious. I love to listen to him speak. I didn't like his acceptance speech in New Hampshire because it sort of went on a while. But when he gives his short 15-minute speech, he's terrific. Yeah.
Do you think we're at a disadvantage sticking to like a two-party system as opposed to other nations?
I wrote a book on that, which is a really good book, by the way. It's called Two Parties or More, ? And the answer that John Bibby, who was as Republican as I am, Democrat, and I wrote the book together, came to, was that our system, particularly single-member districts, the electoral college system, and also our campaign finance system, is really stacked in favor of keeping a two-party system. I just gave a lecture in my party's election class about all the advantages of proportional representation. Nobody ever talks about the disadvantages of proportional representation. We've had a very stable government. We've had a stable government since 1856, in which we've had the same two parties contesting. We sort of know what it's going to be all about. We know we're not going to throw the thing over. That's not a bad thing. I don't believe that the hyper-partisanship that we have today is endemic in our system. I think it may be endemic in some of the politicians we have in office right now. But you can go back to the 1890s, you can certainly go back to the 1860s and see times when partisanship was just as bad as it is now. What we don't have, and again, you know, I think the Cohen Institute is exactly the right direction to go here. We don't have leadership in this country. We don't have people who are willing to stand up, as, by the way, Olympia Snowe was for much of the time that she was in the United States Senate, as are both of our United States senators now. It's like we need to find solutions to problems. I am a Democrat. I probably oppose things that Senator Collins said when in Hill, but I give Senator Collins a great deal of credit for being somebody who understands being a legislator. Certainly Senator King, who was an independent, understands being a legislator. And I think they both understand what leadership is. And we haven't seen that kind of leadership in Washington. Certainly not from the leader of the Republican Party in the Senate, which said that our job is to make Barack Obama a one-term president. That's not leadership. Nor from Harry Reid, the Democratic leader in the Senate, nor from Nancy Pelosi, the Democratic leader in the House. And I would think mostly from, if anybody heard me say this, I wish this wasn't being filmed, but I'll say it anyway. I think people would argue John boehner has done that more than many other people did in the House, and that's why he left. Because he couldn't get anywhere trying to be somebody who was being the speaker for all of the people trying to lead us as Paul Ryan is trying to do now to come up with a budget. And my colleague Walt Stone and I wrote an article once called Boehner's Dilemma. And Boehner's Dilemma was, does he want to be the leader of the Republican Party? Does he want to be the Speaker of the whole House? If you're the leader of the Republican Party, they're going to throw you out. And that's basically happened to him. Now Ryan, I think, faces the same kind of dilemma. So I think it's leadership that we need. And people working together, the Gang of Eight, which both Senator Snowe and then Senator Snowe and Senator Collins were part of breaking down the barriers in the Senate, I think is a really critical kind of thing that people should be paying much more attention to. But I'm not in favor of it. One more?
Yeah, I think we have a chance for one more.
So, thank you all very much. I appreciate your being here.